This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Geoff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Annalise Burkhart from Transparency International US. Welcome to Human Coin.
Hi, Geoff. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. You are the author of a recent publication that TIUS put out called Corruption and Debt: The Case for Leveraging U.S. Diplomacy and Governance Reforms in IMF Lending. I didn't get that out without a few stumbles, but I got the title right.
It's long.
Well, congratulations on putting out the publication.
Thank you.
Why don't you start by telling us a bit about Transparency International US, and then a bit about Transparency International as an organization that works around the world?
Yeah, of course. So Transparency International US was a chapter. It was set up in 2020. So we've been around for a little over 4 years now. And we really focus on stemming the harms caused by illicit finance here in the United States. We work to strengthen political integrity, protect whistleblowers, and promote a positive U.S. role in global anti-corruption initiatives. We primarily work on legislation and advocacy, and so we lobby different agencies of the federal government. We work really closely with the State Department, USAID, the Department of Justice, and again, we try to pass legislation through Congress. We actually got a bill signed into law this past year. It was called the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, and it was the largest expansion to U.S. federal anti-bribery law since the passage of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977.
Wow.
And so we're the U.S. chapter of Transparency International, which is the world's largest and oldest anti-corruption organization. And so they work in over 100 countries worldwide. So each country will have a chapter. And those are national staff who really focus on like the in-country issues. Transparency International Secretariat, the headquarters, is in Berlin, Germany. They have a staff of around 120 people there. And they sort of set the movement objectives and priorities, and then it's really up to the chapters to translate that into the country context.
Understood. And I was going to make a very bad joke and say that anybody could get a law passed in the United States Congress. But of course, that's a terrible joke, knowing full well how difficult it is, especially in the U.S. context, to pass legislation. Do you work on national issues around corruption in the U.S.? Not that we're going to go in that direction today, but are you working mostly on sort of the U.S.'s contribution to anti-corruption internationally, just so I understand?
Ending the U.S.'s contribution to corruption internationally, which, I mean, I think it was 2021 Secretary Treasury Janet Yellen went on the record and said the easiest place to launder money in the world is the United States. Far too often we've seen these illicit financial flows from corrupt foreign leaders, criminals, kleptocrats find their way in the United States to purchase up luxury assets, real estate, cars, jets, you name it. And by allowing, these criminals to launder their money here, we're helping perpetuate corruption around the world. And so we really want to try to end the U.S.'s complicity in this.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot of other countries, including my own country of Canada, that is very, very weak when it comes to anti-money laundering. So I definitely take your point on that. I think I was mentioning before the podcast started that I just wrapped up an interview with Diana Gishengo, who is the head of the head of the Institute for Social Accountability in Kenya, and the coordinator for the Uchumi Coalition. That is sort of fighting for a voice for civil society around debt. But I really expected us to talk about the debt crisis in Kenya. That was supposed to be that conversation. And then our conversation was going to be on the link, our conversation now on the link between debt and corruption. But sure enough, not surprisingly, maybe I was being naive or trying to over compartmentalize, but a lot of our conversation in the first podcast interview was on the same topic, on debt and corruption. Why don't you talk a bit about your publication and maybe talk about sort of your key message and your key findings, and then we can get into some of the issues around that.
Yeah, of course. So we're seeing the IMF negotiate loan agreements, financing agreements with countries around the world worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And a lot of times, this money is going into coffers of state institutions that don't have um, the best sort of regulations and oversight and accountability mechanisms to be able to like spend these funds responsibly. And so this perpetuates a debt trap. These countries are taking out loans. A lot of the loans are being diverted from their intended use. And then the countries keep having to go back to the drawing board, and these loans compound. Interest rates are rising, debt's becoming harder to service, and you just see this cycle. The IMF in the past hasn't paid as much attention as they should on governance issues. These are economists, so they're looking at really, what can we do to shrink this budget deficit? And so they're enacting tax reforms without really addressing, I think, the root cause of so much of the economic crises that we're seeing around the world, which is underpinned by weak state institutions, lack of accountability, lack of oversight, the way that money is just coming in one door and going out the other. And so we wanted to write a paper sort of informed by the work that we've been doing with our chapter in Sri Lanka to lobby the U.S. representation to the IMF to push for more good governance measures and reforms in these loan agreements the IMF is striking with countries. We think that if they're able, like governments are actually able to enact a suite of reforms to ensure that they're responsible enough to spend these funds, that's what's going to be able to build sustainable economies and move countries toward progress in the future.
Yes, absolutely. It's funny because as you might be aware, I wrote a paper that didn't really have the corruption aspect on it, but it was very much about the role of civil society organizations in monitoring IMF agreements. And the findings and one of the case studies was on Sri Lanka. So the head of the TI chapter was interviewed. Well, I interviewed her, and I've met her in person too. She's quite remarkable, quite a powerhouse. But we didn't focus as much on the corruption issue. Do you want to talk a bit about the implications of kleptocracy, which is what Sri Lanka has been labeled as, right? You want to talk a bit about the implications of a kleptocracy being in charge of implementing an economic reform program under the IMF?
Yeah, I think in Sri Lanka, advocates really identified how you had so much high-level government corruption, and so state capture of institutions, conflicts of interest, especially like judges being appointed to roles where they should be able to prosecute corruption cases, and that wasn't happening. Other various forms of malfeasance. I think that all greatly contributed to the genesis of the crisis in Sri Lanka. There was little to no transparency of government spending, opaque procurement processes, and again, it was difficult to ensure that money was being credibly spent. And in other governments too, other chapters that we've spoken with, I've heard from colleagues where they say, oh, the president is the one negotiating all of these loan agreements with the IMF. You're not getting any kind of feedback from Parliament. There are no other, ministries that have any kind of say in this. And other, people are being left out of the negotiating process, which has been extreme concern for people because they're like, we don't really know what the terms that our government is agreeing to. And again, it'll come down in cases like the protests in Kenya, where you have the IMF pushing for these austerity measures that ultimately harm the people. They're the ones that are going to be paying the high price, when in fact you'll still have capital flight leaving countries where there's like a ruling elite, and they're able to siphon off wealth from coffers of public funds, send it abroad. Especially happened in Lebanon. I think it was like 2 months, and they said $800 million had left the country. And so you'll see this disturbing trend in so many countries where the ruling elite is able to sort of like take this deal with the IMF. People pay the price, but they're able to still continue to live this life of luxury untouched.
Mm-hmm. So what were you looking for in terms of the U.S. response?
With Sri Lanka, well, actually, maybe I could just tell you a bit more about the work that we started to do with TI Sri Lanka. So just for some background on that, in March of 2023, the IMF signed a financing agreement. It was an extended fund facility program with the government of Sri Lanka. It's worth $2.9 billion, I believe, to be dispersed in tranches over 4 years. There was a coalition in Sri Lanka of over 100 CSOs, and I think there were like 20 or so groups that sort of took the lead with this. And they went through the initial staff level agreement the IMF signed with the government and wrote down basically all the relevant reforms related to the governance or financial responsibility, fiscal transparency. And then they produced their own diagnostic containing 34 reform recommendations that they would like to see in the report. And those recommendations looked at enhancing transparency and accountability of existing systems, implementing various policy changes, structural transformations necessary to reduce corruption risk and impunity for corrupt officials. We were able to send this publication around to stakeholders in the U.S. government and make sure that they were aware of the requests of the civil society of the people in Sri Lanka. And then the IMF ended up publishing a governance diagnostic, which I can talk about a little bit what those are later too, in 2023. And that contained 16 priority recommendations. And the governance diagnostic only really looks at issues related to financial transparency and governance. 14 of those 16 recommendations ended up being adopted as conditionality, a structural benchmark the Sri Lankan government need to make to receive funds as part of the program. And then we started producing more reports and publications with them. We looked at the governance diagnostic. We looked at where there was overlap with their report, where it differed. And we really wanted to go to the U.S. government because the U.S. has a really unique role in that they have the largest voting share at the IMF. And so we said, in your meetings as the executive board meets, we really want you to push for these reforms because civil society, they're raising, the red flag and saying right now, the way it is, the government, it cannot be trusted to responsibly spend these funds. And these are the measures that you have to have in place to make sure that the financing actually reaches its intended purpose. And we've been working with them on this for well over a year now. We've produced multiple letters that we sent to colleagues at the Treasury Department, at the State Department, and in calls with them frequently to hear about their conversations that they're having with IMF country staff who've been really receptive to these issues. I'll say that the folks that have been traveling over from the IMF to Sri Lanka seem to be really receptive to what civil society is saying. And now, we're going to see what actually gets put into the agreements moving forward and how willing the IMF is to hold the Sri Lankan government, their feet to the fire and make sure that they actually credibly follow through and implement these reforms. And so that's going to be sort of we're monitoring the progress at the moment. I know that the Sri Lankan government published it was a national action plan for implementing their Anti-Corruption Act.
That was unrealistic questions. Yep.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
one of the ways that they're fulfilling, their plan to meet these 14 out of the 16 recommendations that were included in the structural benchmark. In the governance diagnostic. But yeah.
Okay, so one of the things I love about these podcasts is that they often go in unanticipated directions, and you have me thinking, based on some of the work I've done as well recently about IMF reform. And I don't, I'm not trying to oversimplify things, but I really do see, when we're talking about countries like Ghana, Sri Lanka, Kenya, they're all on their 17th or 18th IMF reform program since independence. It's clear the current system's not working. It's clear the current architecture's not working. And it seems like IMF reform is one of the most difficult. Changing an extremely conservative institution like the IMF. I personally think it's fascinating, and I think it's very inspiring. I'd like to see, maybe as a Canadian, we have a Canadian executive director who's on the board as well. There should be more work being done to sort of talk to those directors and make sure that they understand it's not just a matter of staff relations, sort of having senior people present proposals, crunching the numbers and approving them, loan proposals, that is, but actually being involved, but actually making sure that this leads to some kind of tangible reform. Can you go back and just talk a bit more about the work that you've done with the board, maybe just with your executive director, because I think they're still called executive directors, if I'm not mistaken, right? The board member, the board representatives. And then let's talk about whether there's any hope, from here to heaven in changing such a conservative institution. Sorry,
Yeah, of course.
long question there.
No, no. We were able to meet with Director Elizabeth Shortino and her staff on numerous occasions. And again, I think they're extremely receptive to everything that we raised with them. In 2021, the Biden administration actually published their national strategy on countering corruption. And this was really the Biden administration's first time as recognizing corruption as a national security threat. And in that, there were these pillars that they were like, this is what we're going to, focus on. And two of those pillars, one was to strengthen the multilateral anti-corruption architecture on the world. Another one was to leverage foreign assistance resources to advance policy goals. And so this was really in line with the messaging that we saw from the administration. And so for us to be able to take this to them and say, we want to make sure that these funds are not going to be lost, that we're not helping, perpetuate this debt trap that the IMF has rightly been criticized for for years. You're seeing, I think, a growing recognition of these issues at the fund. Since I want to say it was kind of like in the 90s, they started focusing on governance, but it wasn't really until the mid 2000s, late 2000s, and then the 2018 when they adopted this enhanced framework for sort of outlining how they would engage with countries in loan agreements on what they could do, the scope of their work on governance. I think since that framework was adopted at the fund in 2018, and then in line with the priorities that the Biden administration laid out, that gave us a really good on-ramp for dialogue and collaboration with the director and her staff. And again, I think they've been extremely receptive and they wanted to be helpful. I know, of course, it's the IMF. There are a variety of geopolitical interests here at play that, we're not always going to be privy to. There are these considerations, but at the same time, what the United States supports internationally, good governance, rule of law, we basically identified, here are the opportunities for you to support these things, specific time-bound, measurable commitments that the government can make, that civil society knows that they can make. And it was, I think that we had a pretty good working relationship with them, and I'm looking forward to continuing that as we, support other countries too, and other TI chapters in their monitoring. And as they try to provide feedback on the different types of loan agreements and financing being struck with IMF.
Did you get a sense of whether that kind of dialogue is happening with other executive directors, whether other organizations are civil society organizations are also pushing other country directors, executive directors on the board for that kind of, to adopt that kind of wider view of reform?
I think there's been movement on this, like in the past couple of months, honestly. And like since publishing this paper and just like in the lead up, a lot of the conversations that we've been having and sort of socializing the work that we were doing with TI Sri Lanka, we had other people come to us, other chapters. I was in Lithuania in June for the International Anti-Corruption Conference, TI Con, and spoke with a lot of colleagues from other large donor countries, like Germany, the UK. We're like, oh, we're really interested in this, actually. We want to get in touch with folks. What was your strategy here? And so these are new conversations that we're beginning to have, but I think they're really important because the IMF has leverage here. And it's going to be, I think, at the executive board for these directors to really push for these reforms to be put in place. That's where change is going to happen.
Absolutely. Let's go back to Sri Lanka for a moment because you mentioned the anti-corruption legislation. I know there was a bit of a debacle around think a poison pill being introduced into that legislation that made it very, that sort of made it a mixed blessing to have that legislation passed. What are your general impressions of the anti-corruption bill in Sri Lanka? The government's reaction to the requirement for anti-corruption legislation, in terms of whether it addressed the key issues that were required. I think it attacked whistleblowers, if I'm not mistaken.
There's been some concerning legislation moving through the Sri Lankan parliament. I think there was an anti-terrorism bill at one point that would have severely hampered the ability for civil society to continue their operations, monitoring this and speaking out. And this is unfortunately just a really concerning global trend that we've seen from TI chapters everywhere of a shrinking civil space. And unfortunately, maybe I'm being too much of a pessimist here. I don't think I am. But I don't see the IMF really going to bat for civil society as it currently stands. I mean, I don't think that they would necessarily incorporate conditionality around this, because it was already a fight to get them to elevate, these issues of governance to a point where they're actually putting in reforms in their loan agreements. And they still stand by the notion that all of these reforms, whatever pledges and commitments that governments make, it has to be macro critical to the success of the government to be able to meet the program obligations. And so if a government's reform isn't found to be macro critical, it's probably not going to be included. And I think that civil society is sort of in this like gray area where the IMF relies on them. They need to meet with them, but I don't think the IMF is really in a bargaining place right now to say, well, you can't attack civil society, because it's not like they can show a direct correlation between revenue and that.
So interesting. How do you define macro critical?
I'm trying to remember what the IMF uses for that. To be able to meet the fiscal benchmarks as set by the loan program.
That sounds like actually a very good definition. That's very helpful. So I guess the question I want to raise here around and again, it's funny how it kind of goes back to the conversation I just had with Diana in a separate podcast interview, which was probably around the same time, which is she's at the AfroDebt conference right now in Maputo on gender and debt and sort of the gendered effects of public debt from a feminist perspective. And she says in the interview, and she told me off camera as well, that one of the things that she's finding is that there are economists there, and I'm certainly not trying to single out the economists, but there are economists there who really don't see the issue beyond the numbers. And so, when you talk about, for example, the IMF's governance diagnostic, right? That was a great breakthrough for the IMF to come out with that governance diagnostic. It represented a great departure from previous practice, but there was a number of blind spots in that governance diagnostic that is reinforced by a way of thinking at the IMF, a cultural thought that doesn't really consult with international organizations or civil society to make sure they've got the whole picture, but also, limited in terms of the governance diagnostic was not looking at systemic issues like corruption. And that was really what TI Sri Lanka was talking about, right? So I don't know if there's a question in there or that was just a statement on my part, just putting everything together. But I find that a fascinating. I don't know if you have a response to that or not. If not, we'll just chalk it up to my rambling thoughts. But yeah, that's really fascinating. Any thoughts on that?
I'm really looking forward to seeing what governance diagnostics in the future contain. I think there have been 19 reports that have been finalized. Not all of them are made public. That's another thing that we really want to push for the IMF to do. And of course, with the government's diagnostic exercises, again, I guess this is a relatively new tool in the box for the IMF to use. And I mean, these in-depth assessments of corruption risk and governance vulnerabilities across the core state functions. And so it's intended to be a comprehensive look and really pay attention to corruption issues, public contracting, state-owned enterprises, judiciary even. And I know that there are, I think they announced actually, it was the IMF spring meetings I was attending. I think they said there are 5 or 6 more governance diagnostics that are currently being drafted. But the exercise, governments have to ask for it. The IMF can't just mandate, oh, you have to undergo a governance diagnostic exercise. I'm sure they have a little bit of leverage, and I'm sure that they sort of nudge and urge certain countries, certain governments to undergo the exercise. But we'd like to see more countries opt in to this, and then to also publicize them. And we'd also like to see, these issues, corruption, financial transparency, rule of law, being raised more in the Article 4 consultations. And those, of course, are, their annual bilateral sort of economic wellness checkups, with the member countries. And then I guess a component of the Article 4 consultations are also the financial sector assessment programs. I think I'm getting that acronym correct. FSAPs. And those are also supposed to raise these relevant issues to the IMF.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think one of the problems is that with the IMF, and I would say the bank too, and in full disclosure, the World Bank is a client of mine, but nonetheless, I think one of the challenges is that there are too many deep dive specialists at both the IMF and the bank that have been working in a very narrow area for a very long period of time. They're not working vertically. They're not working horizontally. They're working vertically. And so they're very siloed in their thinking. And I think that's one of the big challenges. So around the governance diagnostic is sort of how widely did they consult, not only within the IMF, but also civil society organizations, to make sure that they're really covering fundamental issues.
And I hear from chapters, I get an interesting array of feedback from folks. Some of them have really good working relationships with the IMF country staff that come and visit, and they say, they're really receptive to our problems. They sit down, they're like, this is what we're going to push for. They have a really good working relationship. And then there are other chapters that say, oh, the IMF came, they met with us, and it was a box ticking exercise. It was, all right, we sat down with civil society, we had some coffee, we can put this in a press release. I have one chapter, I won't name who it is, but they said actually the IMF had conducted, I guess, a country visit and didn't meet with civil society, and then put out in a press release they had. And civil society basically reached out to them and said, oh, you need to correct this. You didn't actually do that. And I think another really critical component of why the IMF should not just treat this as a box-ticking exercise, but to really sit down and listen to civil society, is that they're best placed to sort of point out when governments are making reforms that are completely hollow, no teeth. And we saw that in Sri Lanka. I remember the Sri Lanka wasn't the Anti-Corruption Act, it was something else. They had passed as a way to meet a benchmark in a loan agreement. And the IMF was pleased by this, and it was the civil society that pushed back and said, no, these are all the flaws and the loopholes in this law that you wouldn't be able to recognize if it weren't for, in-country experts flagging this for you.
Yeah. And I have seen, through some monitoring that I did for the Canadian government of PFM programming, public financial management programming in the Caribbean, where a lot of the funds were being transferred, Canadian dollars were being transferred directly to the IMF to administer programs. I've seen cases where in the Caribbean, after a economic fund facility comes to an end, there's a lot of backslapping between the government officials and the IMF in terms of what a great job they did and how legendary that job they did. There's a lot of self-congratulation, but that often misses out on the fact that, obviously vulnerable people and vulnerable population groups have been very adversely affected by the austerity programs, the fiscal consolidation programs that have taken place. So I can see how there's really a need for some serious changes to the thinking and to who's involved in making these decisions. I want to go back to the sort of very, very beginning and the question that I wanted to ask you. And maybe you can just take a moment to talk about what you see as the connection between public debt and corruption.
Yeah, of course. Where do I even start with this?
That's a very good way to start, actually.
Corruption sort of underpins. I think you can make the argument that corruption underpins most like social ills that countries face today. And again, you have money that's just being siphoned off or not responsibly spent. And when the rule of law and governance is weak, governments can't be held accountable um, for the decisions that they make. And there are proper measures or proper baselines for governance like around the world. I think that countries and governments should have in place to uphold the rule of law. And it's going to be beneficial ownership. So who actually owns and controls companies? Shouldn't have anonymous companies that maybe are connected to the prime minister's cousin's brother winning state contracts for extremely like inflated amounts of money. Do they have a transparent and competitive open procurement system in that regard? Are there asset declarations for public officials? Is your minister of finance, why does he have like 4 villas in another country? These are all people that have been able to benefit from these state systems, and in so many cases around the world, you see countries, again, that suffer from corruption at the highest levels of the government, where you have a ruling elite that have basically captured state institutions, and they're able to capitalize by managing all these decisions for their own private gain. And again, at the end of the day, you're going to see the citizens that suffer the most. I think especially of like Lebanon, which has taken on so much debt recently. And again, you saw the economic crisis in 2019. I think the World Bank ranked it in the top 3 worst economic crises of the
Didn't know
century,
that. Okay.
where their currency was devalued by like 97 or 98%. And you still had this ruling elite that were able to keep their wealth and move it offshore and rely on enablers. And a lot of these Western democracies, like France, Switzerland, the United States, where again, there was just extreme amounts of like capital flight out of the country. And then you have extreme rampant corruption in state-owned enterprises. The government is just accruing debt that they can't pay back. There you have an electricity sector where there are, power outages now some days for 20 hours because they cannot pay for fuel in the country. And yet, again, the top 1% have been able to still live quite comfortably. These concerning trends, it's not just in Lebanon, it's all around the world where we're just getting, similar reports of this. And these governments keep accruing and just taking on debt to be able to, for their governments to perform basic functions to meet, people's needs. And they're just getting ensnared in this debt trap. And again, with the rising interest rates, it was the one campaign. I think I put this figure in the paper. It was going to cost, I think, was it 56? African nations would pay over 56 billion over the next 5 years just to be able to service their debt due to rising interest rates. So you have just money leaving the country, money coming in, and then the loans compound and sit that trap.
Yeah, and it's interesting going back to this interview with Diana, which I hope you'll watch. And I'm trying to plug it, but it was we touched on so many of these issues. I think, she talked about the fact that in the 24 budget process in Kenya, which of course led to all the protests, right? But the budget process in the parliament, that there was a lot of assurances from parliamentarians that they were going to take into account the views of civil society. And in a sense, it seems like even though there's all these crises going, we're living in a world of polycrises right now. I like that term very much, polycrises. that we're living in a sort of sort of an era of polycrises, that we're not really seeing changes in behavior. And so, going back to the Kenya situation, all these assurances from parliamentarians, I can certainly see that, having worked in parliaments in over 60 countries around the world. I can see very well parliamentarians are very, very suave, very, very conditioned to tell you what you want to hear. But as soon as the public demand for real change, that's sort of where the rubber hit the road, it became clear that the words and assurances of parliamentarians weren't going to be enough. And when they saw the actual budget bill and realized where the situation was at, that it was really not viewed to be in the public interest, that sort of friendliness wore off very quickly, because all of a sudden now their jobs and their interests as MPs are under threat. So I don't like to leave any podcast interview on an optimistic note. So hopefully you'll be more optimistic than I am, but I'm not seeing the fundamental changes that are required. We already talked about the IMF, and it's great that TIUS and others are pushing for change there. But going back to Sri Lanka, when I went to Sri Lanka the first time, I really hoped that I was expecting to see naively that within the parliament, for example, there would be a real desire to tackle this issue head on. And I realized since then that parliaments are basically sleepwalking around the world through the debt crisis in many countries, like Zambia included. There's some effort going on, minimal effort. Maybe one, in Zambia would be the finance committee. That's active. But generally, the change that we need to actually confront these debt crises is just too slow. It's not happening. The attitudinal change is not happening. Again, this sounds more like rambling than the question, but I think, are you more optimistic, or where do you see the real opportunities for change, where we're actually making some progress, as opposed to just status quo?
So I would say I'm sort of naturally a pessimist, but
we're badly matched.
yeah.
I'm a natural cynic.
In this case, my colleagues really make me optimistic, because I hear about the challenges that they're up against. I actually was on a call just earlier with our chapter in Ghana. We spoke with TI Kenya pretty recently. I've been talking to Lebanon a lot, Sri Lanka, and hearing and knowing what they're up against, and continuing to fight for the rights of the citizens in their countries. It's inspiring. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I know it sounds a bit cliche, but when you see these like images and the videos, like especially the protests in Kenya of people out on the street, and they are acting out of awareness of the IMF's severely the policies that the IMF has pushed for decades now that have just sort of left economies in tatters, severe austerity measures where people can't afford just basic necessities. You understand why they're out on the street. And I hope that those messages reach, 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now at the IMF headquarters, and the people here in Washington, hear the demands of the citizens, and they say that they're fed up with this rampant corruption. They want governments that are responsive and accountable to their needs. And seeing civil society organize, like for instance in Sri Lanka, having a coalition of over 100 CSOs that came to the negotiating table and said, this is what we're here to fight for. You need to listen to us because we're representing the interests of the people. It makes my life a lot easier to have really phenomenal colleagues like that who are able to come back, with really precise, exact requests and say, we know that they're capable, the IMF, other lenders, and the US government push for these things. This is what we want to see happen.
I agree with that, actually. And I want to just go back and mention Nadeshani Pereira's name, because my terrible memory meant that I froze when I mentioned, she's the head of the TI chapter, of course. people like that, and women like that, individuals like that, and Diana Gishenko, extremely inspiring to see the work that they're doing, the tireless, endless work that they're doing. So I agree, there's definitely hope out there. So maybe that's a good place for us to leave it. But it's been a really fascinating discussion, Annalise. I appreciate your time, and look forward to reading more publications from you as you continue to travel the world and represent TIUS.
Thanks, Geoff. I really appreciate you having me on and getting to talk about this. It's a really important topic, and I hope that it's elevated, to the forefront of a lot of the policymakers' minds here in DC.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Humankind is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.